Guadalcanal, August 1942. The humid jungle air hung thick with the smell of cordite and death. Marine Sergeant James "Jimmy" O'Brien crouched in a foxhole, his hands trembling as he stared at the weapon that had just failed him. Again. The M50 Reising submachine gun lay beside him, its bolt frozen solid with mud and coral dust. 30 yards away, Japanese soldiers were advancing through the darkness, their battle cries cutting through the night. Jimmy had squeezed the trigger 3 times. 3 times, nothing happened. His squad mate next to him wasn't so lucky. He'd trusted his Reising, too. Now he lay motionless in the mud. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Reising was supposed to be America's answer to the Thompson submachine gun, lighter, more accurate, and cheaper to produce. Eugene Reising himself had promised it would be the finest automatic weapon ever made. Military officials had ordered 60,000 of them. They'd armed entire Marine divisions with this gun. But tonight, in the hell of the Solomon Islands, Jimmy O'Brien learned a brutal truth. Sometimes the difference between a genius invention and a death sentence is measured in grains of sand. This is the story of Eugene Reising, a brilliant firearms designer who created one of the most infamous weapons in American military history. A gun so promising that it armed America's finest warriors, and so flawed that it would become a legend for all the wrong reasons. To understand how thousands of Marines ended up carrying a weapon that would fail them in their darkest hours, we need to go back to where it all began. To understand the gun, we need to understand the man. Eugene Gabriel Reising was born in 1884 in upstate New York. From his earliest days, Eugene was fascinated by mechanisms, clocks, engines, anything that moved with precision. But it was firearms that captured his imagination completely. By the age of 20, he was already working for Winchester Repeating Arms Company, one of the most prestigious firearms manufacturers in America. Eugene wasn't just talented, he was brilliant. He had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that most engineers spent lifetimes trying to achieve. His colleagues at Winchester quickly recognized they were working alongside someone special. By 1918, Eugene had risen to become the head designer at Winchester, a remarkable achievement for a man not yet 35 years old. But Eugene Reising had a problem. He had vision, perhaps too much vision. He saw flaws in firearms designs that others considered perfectly adequate. He imagined improvements that seemed radical, even impossible. And like many brilliant minds throughout history, he grew frustrated working within someone else's constraints. So, in 1920, Eugene left Winchester to strike out on his own. He had ideas, revolutionary ideas about automatic weapons, and he was determined to bring them to life. For the next 15 years, he worked obsessively, often in near poverty, developing and refining his designs. He took on consulting work to pay the bills, but his real passion was his own innovations. The 1930s were a time of global uncertainty. Hitler was rising to power in Germany. Japan was expanding aggressively in Asia, and military planners around the world knew that another great war was coming. The weapon that had dominated the First World War, the heavy machine gun, would need to be supplemented with something new, something that gave individual soldiers automatic firepower, something portable and deadly. The submachine gun was born out of this need. The concept was simple but revolutionary. A compact automatic weapon that fired pistol ammunition instead of rifle rounds. It could be carried and operated by a single soldier, providing devastating close-range firepower. John Thompson had already developed his famous Thompson submachine gun, which saw action in World War I. By the 1930s, the Tommy gun had become an icon, unfortunately as much for gangsters as for soldiers. But the Thompson had a significant drawback. It was expensive. Incredibly expensive. Each cost the military about $200 to produce. That's roughly $4,000 in today's money. For an army preparing to potentially equip millions of soldiers, this was prohibitive. Eugene Reising saw his opportunity. In 1938, he partnered with a businessman named Frank Barnes and approached Harrington and Richardson Arms Company, a respected firearms manufacturer in Massachusetts. His pitch was compelling. He had designed a submachine gun that was superior to the Thompson in almost every way. It was more accurate, it was lighter. It had less recoil. And most importantly, it could be manufactured for a fraction of the cost, just $60 per unit. The executives at Harrington and Richardson were intrigued. They examined Reising's prototypes and were impressed. The gun was genuinely innovative. Instead of using the simple blowback mechanism of most submachine guns, Reising had developed a delayed blowback system. This made the weapon more controllable and accurate. The gun could fire semi-automatically or fully automatically. It even had a compensator to reduce muzzle climb. In 1940, Harrington and Richardson began manufacturing the M50 Reising submachine gun. The military conducted tests, and the results were outstanding. On the firing range, under controlled conditions, the Reising performed beautifully. It was more accurate than the Thompson at virtually every range. It was easier to control during automatic fire. Testers praised its innovative design. The U.S. military placed orders, lots of orders. The Reising would arm American forces in the coming war. Eugene Reising's dream had become reality. His weapon would serve his country. His name would be remembered alongside the great firearms designers of history. There was just one problem. A problem that would reveal itself until American boys started dying on remote Pacific islands. The gun had never been tested in actual combat conditions. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. In a single morning, America was plunged into the Second World War. Suddenly, the nation faced a desperate reality. The military needed weapons, millions of them, and they needed them now. The Reising submachine gun seemed like the perfect answer. It was cheap, easy to produce, and on paper, it was a brilliant piece of engineering. Production at Harrington and Richardson went into overdrive, and by mid-1942, thousands of M50 Reisings were rolling off the line. The Marines in particular received huge quantities. While the Army got the proven Thompson, the Marines needed their own supply of automatic firepower. The first major test for both the Marines and their new weapon came in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. This was America's first major offensive against Japan. It was here the Reising would face its first real trial by fire. And it was here that everything went catastrophically wrong. The problem started almost immediately. As Marines stormed the beaches in August 1942, they discovered their brand new Reisings were jamming. Not just occasionally, but constantly. A few shots, and the gun would lock up tight. Sometimes, they wouldn't even fire at all. At first, they thought it was just bad luck, a few lemons in the batch. But as the brutal battle for Guadalcanal dragged on, the horrifying pattern became undeniable. The Reising was failing systematically, and it was failing in the worst possible place, in the middle of a firefight. So what went wrong? The answer, ironically, lies in the very features that made the Reising seem so brilliant. Its designer, Eugene Reising, had engineered it with incredibly tight tolerances. The tiny spaces between the moving parts gave it exceptional accuracy on a clean firing range. But on Guadalcanal, those tight tolerances became a death sentence. The jungle was a relentless storm of sand, dirt, coral dust, and mud. All it took was a single grain of sand in the wrong place to grind the Reising's complex mechanism to a complete halt. The environment was as much the enemy as the Japanese soldiers. The Marines were fighting through dense jungles, wading through swamps and crawling on sandy beaches. The gun's delayed blowback system, which made it so smooth to shoot, was also incredibly complex. It was full of small, delicate parts that just couldn't stand up to the abuse of combat. When you're fighting for your life, you don't have time to field strip and meticulously clean your weapon every few hours. But perhaps the most infuriating flaw was the magazine. The Reising's magazine catch was so poorly designed that it would often release on impact. A Marine diving for cover would hit the dirt, and his magazine would just fall out, leaving him with an empty weapon. The magazines themselves were open to the elements, constantly filling with debris that would cause feeding failures. One Marine, Robert Leckie, later wrote, "It was a fine-looking weapon, but that's where its virtues ended. In combat, it was worse than useless. It was dangerous because you couldn't count on it." Stories of the Reising's failures spread like wildfire. Marines started leaving them behind, arming themselves with anything else they could find. Captured Japanese Arisaka rifles, pistols, knives, even makeshift clubs. Some men, in pure disgust and frustration, threw their Reisings into the ocean. Others learned to use them as clubs when they inevitably jammed. The most heartbreaking stories are of the Marines who died because their weapon failed them at the critical moment. Men who pulled the trigger as an enemy charged only to hear a lifeless click. Sergeant Mitchell Page, who earned the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal, said it best. "I saw good Marines die because of that weapon, not because they didn't know how to use it, not because they didn't maintain it, but because it was fundamentally flawed." The Marine Corps had a crisis on its hands. It had sent its men into one of the fiercest battles of the war with a gun that was actively getting them killed. Furious reports flooded back to headquarters from the field. By November 1942, just 3 months after the invasion, the Marine Corps began a desperate scramble to replace every Reising they could find with Thompsons and the new M1 carbine. But the damage was done. Thousands of Marines had fought and died, betrayed by the very tool meant to protect them. The entire country was asking a simple, horrifying question. How did this happen? How did a weapon so obviously flawed ever make it into the hands of frontline troops? The investigations began immediately. Congress demanded answers. The public wanted to know who sent American boys to war with junk. For Eugene Reising, the designer, it was a devastating blow. He had genuinely believed he was creating a superior weapon. The initial tests had looked promising. So what went wrong with the process? Well, the first problem was the testing itself. The military trials that approved the Reising were conducted under perfect, sterile conditions. Clean firing ranges, professional armorers, and plenty of time for maintenance. These tests measured things like accuracy and rate of fire, but they completely failed to simulate the brutal chaos of a real-world battlefield. Nobody thought to drag a Reising through the mud, dunk it in salt water, or see if it would still fire after being neglected for days by a terrified, exhausted teenager. It was a failure of imagination, but also a product of the times. In 1940, America hadn't fought a major war in over 20 years. No one truly understood the kind of jungle hell that awaited them in the Pacific. But there was another, more powerful factor at play: sheer desperation. After Pearl Harbor, with the Philippines falling, the military was in a panic. There simply weren't enough Thompsons to go around. The Reising was cheap, it was available, and the paperwork said it worked. In the mad rush to arm a nation for war, warning signs about its complex design were ignored. Eugene Reising himself wasn't blameless. He was a brilliant gunsmith, but he had designed a gentleman's weapon for a theoretical war, not the down-and-dirty war America was actually fighting. He was a perfectionist who created a weapon that only worked in perfect conditions. Harrington and Richardson, the manufacturer, also faced criticism for quality control issues that arose from rushing production to meet impossible demands. But the harshest judgment fell on the military procurement system. How could the Marine Corps, an organization famous for its high standards, accept a weapon that would fail its men so completely? The answer is a grim mix of bureaucracy and the fog of war. By the time the horrifying reports started coming in from Guadalcanal, tens of thousands of Reisings had already been produced and shipped. Admitting the mistake would have been a massive political and public relations disaster. So, at first, the brass tried to downplay the problem. They blamed the Marines themselves. The troops were told they just needed to clean their weapons more carefully. This, as you can imagine, went over about as well as a lead balloon. The Marines on the ground knew the truth. They were the ones dying. Finally, the mountain of evidence became impossible to ignore. In early 1943, the Marine Corps officially declared the Reising unsuitable for combat. The guns were pulled from the front lines. Some were given to military police or the Coast Guard for security duties in clean, safe environments where they performed reasonably well. Many were just locked away in armories, a monument to a terrible mistake. Eugene Reising's reputation was destroyed. He had hoped to be remembered alongside legends like John Browning. But instead, his name became a byword for failure. The Reising submachine gun is now a classic case study, a permanent fixture on lists of the worst weapons of World War II. It's a tragic story of good intentions, desperate times, and a fatal disconnect between the drawing board and the battlefield. It's a powerful reminder that in war, the only thing that matters is what works when everything else has gone wrong. The failure of the Reising submachine gun had consequences that echoed far beyond the jungles of Guadalcanal. For the Marines who survived, it became a bitter memory. Many refused to even talk about it. PFC Eugene Sledge, in his famous memoir, With the Old Breed, recalled veterans speaking of the Reising with contempt bordering on hatred. To them, it wasn't just a faulty gun. It was a betrayal by the very system that was supposed to protect them. This raw emotion forged a new rule in Marine Corps culture: never blindly trust your equipment. The military was forced to learn a hard lesson. The Reising disaster revolutionized weapons testing. New protocols were established to mimic the hell of actual combat: dirt tests, mud tests, saltwater exposure, firing thousands of rounds without cleaning. These became the new standard, procedures still used today, all born from the failure of one gun. Firearms designers took notes as well. The next generation of military weapons, including the legendary M16 rifle, would prioritize rugged reliability over delicate refinement. In fact, Eugene Stoner, the M16's designer, specifically studied the Reising's failure to ensure his weapon could function even when filthy and neglected. Ironically, early M16s in Vietnam would face their own reliability issues, proving that some lessons unfortunately need to be learned more than once. But what about the man behind the gun, Eugene Reising? His story is tragic. Once the head designer for Winchester, a true genius of his craft, he never recovered from the catastrophic failure of his creation. He spent years trying to improve the design, but his reputation was permanently shattered. No military would touch a Reising design ever again. He faded into obscurity, a brilliant mind crushed by one critical error in judgment. He died in 1967, largely forgotten. It's important to understand Eugene Reising wasn't a villain. He was a talented designer who wanted to help his country. His mistake was designing a weapon for a perfect world, a clean firing range, not for the chaos and filth of a real war. In a way, that makes his story even more tragic. He was brilliant enough to create something that worked perfectly in theory, but not wise enough to understand that in combat, theory is meaningless. The Reising also became a textbook case of procurement failure. It raises questions we still struggle with today. How do you balance the urgent need for weapons in wartime with the necessity for thorough testing? How do you stop a flawed piece of equipment from being pushed into soldiers' hands by sheer bureaucratic momentum? The Reising wasn't the first weapon to look good on paper and fail in the field, and it certainly wasn't the last. After the war, most Reisings were destroyed or given away. A few found their way to the civilian market, where, surprise, they actually worked pretty well as police or sporting guns. In a controlled environment with proper care, the design was solid. Today, it's a collector's item, famous not for its success, but for its spectacular failure. So what are the real lessons here? First, theory is not practice. The Reising was innovative, accurate, and clever, but war isn't fought on paper. The crude, heavy, expensive Thompson submachine gun was inferior in almost every way, except one. It worked when you pulled the trigger. And in a firefight, that's the only thing that matters. This is a lesson for engineers in every field. Optimize for the real world, not the ideal one. Second, you have to test for the worst-case scenario. The original tests measured what was easy: accuracy, rate of fire. They didn't measure how it would hold up in the hands of an exhausted teenager, covered in mud, in the middle of a jungle ambush. Your product, whether it's software or a medical device, must work when everything goes wrong, not just when everything goes right. Third, there's a powerful lesson about the courage to admit a mistake. When reports of the Reising's failures first came back, the initial response was denial. The Marines were blamed for poor maintenance. This denial cost lives. Admitting we were wrong is hard, but delaying that admission in a critical situation can be fatal. And perhaps the most important lesson is about the human cost. It's easy to talk about this as an engineering case study, but we must never forget that real people died because this gun failed. Young men who trusted their equipment and were betrayed by it. Behind every failed weapon is a human tragedy. The ultimate lesson of the Reising is that the decisions made in boardrooms and design labs have life or death consequences on the battlefield. Eugene Reising's intentions were good, but intentions don't matter as much as outcomes. And the outcome of his brilliant, flawed design was that American Marines went into battle with a weapon that couldn't be trusted. The M50 Reising submachine gun remains a powerful reminder that perfection in theory means nothing if it can't survive the brutal imperfection of reality.